Uh, right on time. So in conclusion, so these are two judges who are actually serving in my hometown of Lahore. And when my basically paper is saying when Justice Mirza is going to go to court on Monday, he is less likely to rule in favor of the government, I would hope. And he will issue decisions, especially less likely in cases involving land expropriation and political opponents. And he will rule cases faster and issue judgments more on the merits of the case relative to, say, legal network. So thanks a lot. And if you still don't believe me, I have this always slides that there are a lot of people now who are saying that they are going to change the selection procedure if they're ever re-elected. So I don't have high hopes for this reform to stay, but let's see. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Sultan. You are definitely on time. You actually started a little late, so I had a couple more minutes, but thank you. So let me just open, see if anyone has any questions at this point. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any.
Okay, I have one question that I'm not 100% sure it even makes much sense, but let me try. In the spirit of the omitted intercepts problem with diff and diffs, do you have a sense of how much of the total drop in state wind frequency is explained by this exact diff and diff variation you're identifying?
Yeah, so for this, yeah, so first of all, it's of course possible that it is correlated with omitted, for example, intercepts. But for this to work, it's not just a diff and diff, it's also an IV. So mostly we have to think about the exclusion restriction. So I would be more worried not about whether your trends are being messed up or something with the omitted intercepts. I would be worried whether the 62nd birthday, whether districts that got more 62nd birthdays, those were already on different trajectories than, for example, districts which, for example, had less mandatory retirements. Now, afterwards, we cannot check it, right? But we can check just before, because afterwards, that's what we are using our counterfactual from. So it's, yeah, so ideally, maybe you could kind of try to decompose the fraction of variation due to omitted intercepts, yeah. But yeah, then I would be able to answer your question better, I guess. But I usually, when I think about a threat to identification, I usually think of this, like, for example, my main specification I've not shown you is basically a reduced form. It's like mandatory retirements interacted with post-reform dummy. So I am not even thinking of myself as a pure defendant, although I presented here. Yeah, so I think of it as a IV, reduced from IV. Mandatory retirements are affecting state winds. Why? I say, well, assuming the exclusion restriction only in 2010. So what is interesting is that you can actually look at mandatory retirements in 2009 and use the age structure of judges in 2009 and interact it with the post-reform. Yeah, I did a post-coup paper, so I'm saying post-coup, but yeah, the post-reform dummy, and you kind of see, yeah, you see there is no effect there. So it kind of is suggesting that at least omitted variables and retirements are not kind of. So there is something suspicious. Why does it only happen in 2010, not in 2009 or 8 or 7 or 6? Thanks.
Okay, we still have maybe 2 minutes. So if there's any other quick question that Sultan can quickly get back to you, otherwise we can go ahead with Ricardo. No? Okay, Ricardo. So feel free to go ahead.
Great, can you see my screen? Okay, I'll try to go for 15 minutes. Thanks everybody for being here. This is also probably the last time I'll present this paper as well. So I'm with Sultan and it hasn't been accepted yet, but I'm in the celebration mood. This was my John Markey paper, Development via Administrative Redistricting, Evidence from Brazil. It's joint work with Cristiane Sherman, which many of you know. So to begin with and to motivate, I'd like to define administrative redistricting. In the context of Brazil, this is the creation of new units via splits. It fits inside this broader class of decentralization reforms that involve any type of subnational border change, which has been very common in the last few decades and across the world. In developing country context, this type of reform may benefit the periphery, which was prior neglected by the urban center. It can be a mechanism to redistribute autonomy and fiscal resources to where returns may potentially be the highest in areas that were neglected and poor and less educated, that grew less at baseline. Of course, this may imply a type of equity efficiency trade-off, because by setting up new governments, these places are duplicating costs to set up a bureaucracy, set up buildings, build a town hall, etc. But it may come to the benefit of reducing inequality and poverty. Empirically quantifying this question of whether the creation of new government units affects development has been challenging for at least 3 reasons that are worth pointing out. One is that boundaries change only very rarely over time and space. 2, when splits do happen, they're never really random, both who splits and how exactly they split. And 3, there's usually no data on the subunits of places that are splitting, such that it's hard to track them over time in a consistent boundaries way. So in this paper, we'll make progress answering this question of, do administrative splits promote local development? And if yes, how? The context will be Brazil, which is a really compelling setting for multiple reasons. But the 2 main ones would be that by law, municipalities have a lot of administrative, fiscal, and decision-making power. There was a sharp move towards decentralization of powers in the 90s after the new constitution. And the second point is that in Brazil, municipalities have a standardized horizontal structure, in the sense that regardless of how large a municipality is or how small, they all have the same rights and obligations by the letter of the law, regardless whether they're 20 million people in size or 5,000, as opposed to the US, for example, where there's huge variation. And during the period we'll study, there's this rapid growth in the number of municipalities that we'll use for identification. And the spirit of the paper will be leveraging variation in splitting decisions, places that effectively split with places that almost split, and estimate this diff and diff, comparing them over time. And we'll be exploiting a lot of the context, the details we know of the institutional background, and the data to exploit some of the mechanisms previously studied in the literature. And as you'll see, just from the get-go, caveats are that the paper is mostly silent about country-level net welfare effects, and politics mostly for data limitations. As a preview of the results, first we document that these splits are initiated by these very small rural and remote districts within municipalities. When splits do happen, they cause an array of effects. First, they causes reallocation of federal transfers over space within states that I'll explain exactly how it happens. It also causes substantial growth of the public sector and of economic activity locally that's solely driven by the new units. That we find almost zero effects and spillovers on the remaining parts of the municipalities that split, and effects on delivery of public services, we find that are basically supply driven and are on the range of 6 to 14% across services. We, in the end, interpret these results as adjustments to administrative remoteness, reduction in the distance between the town hall and the localities, and adjustments to local politics and local preferences, less so as an effect of fiscal transfers. I'll get into some details for each of these. So a very quick crash course in Brazilian politics. The country is divided into 3 tiers of government: federal, state, and municipalities. For the remaining of the talk, remember that districts are smaller than municipalities. Municipalities have lots of attributions, and in terms of education, basic health, sanitation, etc., which were basically strengthened and defined by the new Constitution in 1988. This Constitution substantially also facilitated splits. It gave states the legislation power over requirements for splitting. And on average, it drove the requirements really low. So municipalities only needed about 5,000 people and a unilateral referendum vote to split. So within a municipality, if there were two districts, A and B was deciding to split, it only needed a 50% majority within B to vote in favor. District A didn't have to agree. The new constitution also formalized and increased this federal transfer scheme that in some favored small municipalities by guaranteeing a floor to revenues, and established this zero-sum nature of within state. When a new municipality is created, all others would lose a little bit in a dispersed cost fashion, and new municipalities would gain in concentrated fashion. This change after the Constitution drove a substantial wave of creation of new municipalities. As you can see in the figure on the right, prior to the new Constitution, the number of municipalities was roughly constant. It grew much more slowly. And in the 90s, you see this explosion in the number of municipalities of about 23% in basically two waves that ended in 1996 when a new amendment passed in Congress, halting the whole process. So we'll be studying this period in the early 90s. The main idea for identification will be comparing places that effectively split with places that almost split, where almost splitting is defined by having a request sent for splitting and having it not approved. That could be either because it was actually rejected, or it could just be because it was left open if a place applied too late, say by 1994, 1995, and when the new amendment hit in 1996, they simply had no time to go through the bureaucratic steps. And we'll be estimating two types of differences. One, comparing full municipalities that split to full municipalities that almost split. And we'll also be doing a more disaggregated version where we can compare the district that applies to split and does split effectively with a district that applies and doesn't, and so on and so forth for remaining in headquarters distinctively. So very quickly, we show that applicants are worse off at baseline, comparing columns 1 and 5. They're much smaller. They're about 6,000 people on average, and they have less public services. They have less average luminosity at baseline as compared to headquarters. So these are really the places in the rural outskirts of municipalities that are splitting. The main specification is a standard diff and diff. I won't get into details for the sake of time, but the first sanity check result we find is that after a split, there's this substantial growth in receipt of federal transfers in these municipalities of about 30 log points, about 35% for these places. That is stable and starts really sharply after the split, which makes sense with the context given the allocation rule I quickly described. This increase in revenue is also substantially converted to expenditures, and particularly it's converted to capital expenditures, to investments. Right after the split here on the left, we see this sharp increase, sharp spike in investments that is consistent with the new municipality, basically, building a town hall, building infrastructure, potentially schools, etc. And in the middle in figure 3 and 4, we also see this reflected in hiring of bureaucrats, both in terms of current expenditures that amount to basically salaries, and in terms of public jobs from data, with data from HISE aggregated to the municipality level. What's really striking is that when changing the outcome to nighttime luminosity as a proxy for growth and a proxy for also the delivery of electricity to households, on the left, when aggregating this to the municipality level, exactly 5 minutes, okay, exactly to what as I did before, we find this about 8% effect at the municipality level, but disaggregating it to the district level, we show that this is solely driven by these applicant districts, the parts that effectively become a new municipality, and we find a 0 for the rest. Let me skip this and just say that results survive a variety of robustness checks, including a regression discontinuity exercise where we compare places that vote 48% in favor of splitting versus places that vote 52% in favor of splitting, say, and compare them over time, and results survive that, in case you're worried about selection into splitting. Very quick, well, let me skip this just to say that we find substantial effects on school attendance with microdata from the census that's only happening on the age that kids attend municipality schools and doesn't happen for older kids that are attending state level schools or federal level schools. So there's evidence of this supply side shock to the delivery of public services. And I could say more about that, but let me just quickly, for the sake of time, skip. In the paper, we have this very simple conceptual framework of provision of public goods under redistricting, where one district is deciding whether to split. And we have some predictions about the size and the direction and magnitude of these effects. We'll argue that effects will be larger when there's more heterogeneity in preferences across districts, when there's administrative distance and remote and cost for that, and neglect by the headquarters, and when there are larger fiscal transfers as well, as is perhaps expected given the context. In the paper, we do a lot to show that there's evidence in favor of 1, 2, and 3, and not that much in favor of fiscal transfers directly, which lead us to interpret this as effects of autonomy and adjustments to local preferences, as opposed to this is simply a more money story, as you could potentially interpret. Since I am short on time, let me skip the effects on mechanisms and just conclude with this other question of this outstanding question of what is the aggregate effects of splits at the country level. We could ask, how did splitting change aggregate welfare, since it's not only giving autonomy to new areas, but also reshuffling fiscal transfers, and the rest of the state is losing some of its revenue to these new municipalities. So basically, on net, is it good or bad to allow for these new municipalities to exist? So it's that's a tough question to answer, which one may need more structure. In the paper, we're proposing 2 simple back of the envelope exercises. First, we can, at the state level, exploit variation in the number of splits, which leads to variation in the amount of transfers reshuffled within the state, and estimate the effects of that reshuffling on the non-split municipalities. And as you'll see, this is done at the state level, so it's a much smaller sample, but it's potentially suggestive. And we can also do an exercise of accounting returns, basically the returns of night lights on $1 that is reshuffled around, and see what's the aggregate number there. The first exercise, exploring variation in federal transfers reallocated at the state level. So you'll see that sample here is only 25, as opposed to many hundreds or thousands. But in any case, we are finding negative effects on public jobs, private jobs, and other outcomes of interest. However, these magnitudes are really low, really small. When you compare it to the mean change at the state level, these are really, really tiny and not statistically significant. The second exercise is this simple returns accounting where we use the changes in night lights at the district level as a measure, as a proxy for growth. I won't claim it's a proxy for welfare, but just a proxy for growth. And if you just do the weighted calculation here with returns and population shares and the amount transferred between groups, we find that the aggregate effect of reshuffling transfers on night lights would be negative if the return on $1 for night lights in non-split municipalities was greater than 4.5%. And given our estimates on the separate exercise, that doesn't seem to be the case. So on net, this effect would be potentially positive, but of course it's a back of the envelope calculation. So to conclude, on time, I hope, almost, this paper is studying administrative redistricting, reducing regional inequality in Brazil. We argue that autonomy is one of the key drivers behind these effects, and this paper informs broader literature on decentralization and the size of nations. Of course, it would still take more structure and potentially a larger model to say something sharper about efficiency and losses. And that's we leave for future work. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Ricardo. So Antonella, I think you have your hand raised. I'll mute. Feel free to ask a question.
Thank you, Thiago. Thank you, Ricardo. So this is very interesting. And I think the fact that it's not about just giving money, it's interesting, but it's not counterintuitive, because we know that if capabilities are not there, then having a lot of money doesn't mean it's going to translate into public goods. But the question I had was, so is the story a bit about what do you mean about autonomy? Like, is the story about being able to lobby more with the central government to get more public goods? And can you see, like, are they getting more projects that are actually funded by the central government? And that's what's causing like a multiplier effect on the economy? Or is it like public employment that is causing like, I don't know, now there's a new municipality, so new people are being hired, and that also has some effects on the local economy. So yeah, I was wondering if you can expand a bit more on that.
Right. Yeah, thanks for the question. This is great. So the claim on autonomy comes from a few sources. One, just anecdotally, there's a survey from the early 90s asking why did municipalities split, and what were the main determinants and challenges of splitting. And one of the main questions were, one of the main replies were neglect by the town hall and the distance between where they were and their original town hall, making it more difficult to convey their preferences and to get policy allocated to their municipality. That's just anecdotal, but in the paper we show that when a split happens, these two municipalities are now electing mayors from different parties about 80% of the time, as a potential sign for preference heterogeneity and differences in local policy, of course, subject to caveats about what parties could mean at the local level in Brazil at the time. And we show that the effect is larger for places farther away. So in some, we're seeing that the effects are larger in this example, but it could also, of course, be that money matters and there's a local bureaucracy being set up and other things that you also brought up. But that's the gist of it.
Okay. Any follow-up? We still have a couple of minutes for Ricardo. So any other questions, or Antonella, you want to have any follow-up questions?
Thanks a lot. It's fun to present.
Okay, Ricardo, thank you very much. So I'll give the floor to Marcela. Marcela, feel free to share a screen and start.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this presentation. It's a great opportunity to be here. So today I'm going to present my work, The Effect of Media on Religion, Evidence from the Rise of Pentecostals in Brazil, which is joined with Giulia Buccioni, that is my classmate. So the Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world, especially in Latin America and Africa. Two important characteristics of this movement is that they intensely use media to spread their message, and they are more conservative than other Christian faiths. So for instance, they tend to condemn more homosexuality, to believe more that the wife should obey to the husband, or to be more against abortion. And although this religious movement has been growing a lot, there's still very little is known about the socioeconomic consequences of their expansion. So in this paper, we want to understand what is the effect of religious media on religious affiliation. And besides understanding if people change their religious affiliation, we also want to understand if people follow the behaviors prescribed by the church. So it's not only about saying, oh, we are not changing the religion, but if we are actually following it. And to do that, we take advantage of the purchase of Record TV, which is a Brazilian TV channel, which was bought in 1990 by a Pentecostal bishop and started broadcasting religious content. So in this paper, we're going to look at the effect of the expansion of this TV channel on religious affiliation and adherence to church prescribed behaviors. In particular, we're going to look at fertility, labor force participation, voting, and crime. So Brazil, it's traditionally a very Catholic country, but Catholics have been losing space for evangelicals, in particular for Pentecostals. To put some figures, like in the 90s, they grew like about 3 times. So it's like a huge increase. And what is important, as I mentioned before, is that they tend to be more conservative than other Christian faiths. To illustrate this point a bit further, we see here in this table in panel A that Pentecostals tend to practice religion more frequently than Catholics, that they think that religion should be taught to kids. They also are more against homosexuality and abortion compared to Catholics. And going further to actual behaviors, in terms of expenditure, we see that they tend to spend less on alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and entertainment. By entertainment, I mean dancing clubs and love hotels compared to Catholics. But if you compare to like regular goods like transportation and food outside home, these two groups are the same. So it's not there different in like everything. It's mostly on this kind of behaviors. So to further illustrate Pentecostalism in Brazil, I brought 2 quotes from Edir Macedo, which is the founder and leader of one of the main Pentecostal churches in Brazil. So once he said, what is taught today is, my daughter will never submit to a man. Fine. She'll be then submitted to unhappiness because there doesn't exist family marriage, because there doesn't exist happiness when the woman is the head and the man is the body. It's a failure. And the other was, I want my daughter to marry a macho. The man has to be the head. They have to be the head, because if the man is not the head, then marriage is fated to failure. So it's like kind of strong how they see society. So in this paper, I'm going to take advantage of Record TV. So Record TV is a Brazilian TV channel that used to be a secular channel, but in the late 80s, it went bankrupt and it was bought by Edir Macedo. I want to highlight here that the media market in Brazil, it's very concentrated, especially around this period, and was dominated by a few large companies. So the bankruptcy of like a big TV channel was a very uncommon event. So this was kind of a unique opportunity to buy. It's not like that there was several TV channels, you can buy TV channels all the time. It's like a very specific event. And after the 90s, Record TV started broadcasting religious content. And by religious content, they have like moralizing soap operas, biblical documentaries, and live talks in which people give testimonials on how religion changed their lives. And to provide some idea about the amount of religious content, it's estimated that in the 90s, Record TV had around 60 hours of religious content, while the other two main TV channels in Brazil had an hour and 12 minutes per week. So it's a considerable difference. So after being bought by Edir Macedo, Record kind of expanded a lot and kept expanding over time. And nowadays it's like kind of covers almost the whole country, but around the period that we're gonna study, they went from about 30% to almost 6%. We use several administrative data sets that you guys are mostly familiar with. I just want to highlight that we use for coverage, we use data from Anatel, the National Agency of Telecommunications, in which we have data about each transmitter. So we know all the technical characteristics and also know the date of installation and who is the owner. And to construct our measure of coverage, we use the regular terrain model, which is fairly common in this literature. And first, we start by computing the signal strength in the free space. So using data on the transmitter's characteristics, like such as power and frequency, and the distance between the transmitter and the receiving locations, we know what is the signal strength. Then we also compute the signal strength that accounts for geomorphological characteristics. So if there is like a mountain or a dense vegetation around, the signal, this actual signal, we account for that. And this actual signal, it's a good predictor of actual audience and has been largely used in this literature. Here, I'm gonna skip this, I don't have much time, but just to validate this measure, I show that when the signal is very low, like below -6 decibels, there's no viewership of this channel, but when the signal increases above about -60, then you see a big increase in audience. So just showing that if the signal is too low, there's no viewership. And going for the empirical strategy. So I estimate the outcome for individual I at municipality M and time T. I regress that on the actual signal at municipality M and time T, and on the signal in the free space, on individual characteristics, municipality characteristics that change over time. I include also municipality fixed effects and state-specific time trends. And so here, my parameter of interest, it's gamma 1, so it's the actual signal. And the identification here is coming from the installation of transmitters over time. So here we are comparing places where the signal, the evolution in places where the signal increased with the evolution of places where the signal didn't increase. And then we also control for the signal in the free space. The idea is that places that are close to the transmitters, they may have trends that are different from places that are farther away. So this is because like the signal is pretty much a function of the distance to the transmitters. So if you imagine that the transmitters are being installed in places that are going faster, then the signal in the free space is gonna pick up everything that is related to the distance, but not the actual coverage, which is gonna be picked up by this. I'd like to pause here and ask if it's clear. And so the idea here is that our parameter of interest, it's identified net of changes in the distance to the transmitters. And I also want to highlight this is quite standard in the literature. So going for the main results, I show first, in this first column, I do this regression, but without controlling for the signal in the free space and without adding municipality characteristics or state specific time effects. And I see here that when the signal increased by 1 standard deviation, there is an increase in the share of Pentecostals. And then in the second column, I add for the signal in the free space. We see that there's a increase in the coefficient, which is consistent with the transmitters being installed in places that are growing faster, because usually Pentecostals grow more in places that are poor. And then in the third column, I also add the state fixed effect and show that the effect it's quite similar. And then in the fourth column, I show that if we regress the change of the signal in the 90s on the share of Pentecostal in the 80s, there's no effect. So this would be show that there's no pre-trend. And then I show that most of, in this place also there's a reduction on the number of Catholics, which is consistent with what this sociology literature says, that most of the conversions come from Catholics and not from other religions such as Protestants, which also are usually smaller, but still like this is consistent with what the sociology literature says. And well, one kind of limitation of this empirical strategy is that I only have 2 periods in time. So it's hard to see what is coming first. And so I take advantage of data on the number of churches, which I have yearly data. It's not a census data. It's data from the IRS. So I know when each religion for each denomination was built. And then I estimate an event study. So I show here that after the increase in the number of churches do not precede the increase in the signal. So like, although I cannot rule out that the church was doing several types of investment, I can say that the signal is indeed drive an increase in the share of Pentecostals. Then going for I think the most interesting results, we'll have the results on behaviors. So first we show that there is an increase in fertility, so which is consistent with what they say, and a decrease in female labor force participation and an increase in male labor force participation. So all these results are consistent with the men being like the mainly the homemaker. And then we find a decrease in homicide rate would be a proxy for risky behavior. So people tend to go out less, drink less, and so on. So this could drive a decrease in the homicide rate. Also could be through labor force participation, since men tend to work more. We know that working is a way to keep people away from crime. And finally, we show that there is an increase in the share of Pentecostals. So here we measure Pentecostals, and some people have done in the literature, like we don't know from the electoral data people's religion, but then we identify when people disclose then in their alien name, like they say pastor or something like that. So then we classify candidates as Pentecostals or Catholics, and we see that there is an increase in the share of Pentecostal candidates. So for the fertility outcome, we have the advantage that we know exactly when each woman gave birth to each kid. So we know exactly when each kid was born, and we are able to also do an event study similar to the other one. And we show here that after Record TV entering the country, in the municipality, there's an increase in the fertility rate. This is accounting for the pregnancy length. So take 2 years before the entering, we see that there is an increase in the fertility rate. We do several robustness. The first is to show that selection is not driving the results. So Record TV is not installing the new transmitters based on the share of Pentecostals in 1991. And well, I think I'm a bit short on time, but I'll just highlight these other robustness, we use an alternative empirical strategy in which we use only the variation that's coming from the transmitters that were installed before Record TV being religious affiliated, and we instrument the actual signal by the signal around this period, and we show that the results are exactly the same. So this suggests that our results are not driven by reversed causality. And well, I do several other empirical strategies, but to show that our results are not driven by places that are growing faster or larger and so on. Yeah, and so to conclude, in this paper, we show that religious media can affect religious affiliation, and besides changing people's religion, it can also affect church prescribed behavior such as fertility, labor force participation, voting, and crime. And our results are robust to several approaches. That's it.
That was great. Thank you very much, Marcela. So Wagner, yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Marcela. That's indeed a very interesting paper. I was actually, my question was a little bit answered by your robustness slide, but I was thinking about the point that you mentioned that there's no evidence that they were putting new transmitters in places where there are more Pentecostals in 1991. But I was thinking like maybe the strategy would be put more transmitters where they think they can convert more people, right? Where for example, you have this paper by Chico and Woody, etc., where they show people tend to be more converted, where you have like more economic downturns during the 90s. So places where probably you'll have this trade liberalization negative shock. So I was thinking maybe if that would be a concern to your strategy, or whether you have looked on that kind of thing. Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks for your question. So we do several tests to show that they are not putting the transmitters in places that are growing faster. But I guess the most compelling answer to your question would be the IV strategy, in which we use only the variation that is from the transmitters that were there already. So it cannot be related to anything that was happening in the 90s. And we show that our results hold. Yep. But yeah, it's hard to say, like, because they are, obviously Record TV had religious ambitions, so they want to convert more people, but they also are a profit maximizer firm. So they also want to put the transmitters in places that probably are wealthier and so on, because they want to make more money. So it's hard to say in which way things go. But what we show is that the installation of new transmitters was not based on the share of Pentecostals. So either if you think that they would put the transmitters where there were more or less Pentecostals, like we don't find any evidence that this was driving the choice of the placements.
Can I step in? Thanks, Marcelo. This is super interesting, and I was hoping, like, we in Brazil, we always wanted to know what is the causal effect of Universal and TV, religious TV. So yeah. This is awesome to see. One question, I have a few questions, but the main one is, since essentially this is a bundle treatment, right? There are many things that religious TV does. I was wondering if there's any way to separate potential mechanisms, and if there's variation in what exact person they broadcast in specific municipalities, like what pastor, and if they emphasize different aspects of the Bible, or just simply more conservative attitudes that don't necessarily speak to religion, etc. Is there any way to separate these in the data?
That's a good question. Like the main limitation of that is that, like, religious data, it's just like using the census, because other things, like, we cannot see like specific trends. But yeah, I would love to be able to point out like what is the exactly content that is driving the results. but I couldn't come up exactly with anything. The only thing that I could come up with like just the growth of new churches that we can see that they did not predate the installation of new transmitters. But I don't think this answers your question.
It's just, of course, it's really hard to code these things up.
Yeah, but if you have any idea, I'd love to know.
Can I ask a quick question? By the way, great paper. Maybe I missed something because I missed part of the presentation, but can you do event studies for a bunch of other outcomes that you use? And the second question is, can, for instance, the expansion of this TV access or TV coverage or whatever come together with, for instance, some movement to install churches as you showed, and then this makes people move, for instance? So if I'm more Catholic, maybe I move around a bit, like to deal with some migration.
So for the later question, well, it's possible that people move, but I think it's not so likely that people just getting access to this TV channel and then these places are getting stronger, like in terms of Pentecostalism, that they would just move because of that. But yeah, in principle, it's something that I could test in the data, like using the census to see if people are like according to their religion, if there are different patterns of migration. It's a good point. And about the event study, yeah, this is, I guess, like for labor force participation, I could use maybe RISE to come up with more frequent data, but then we have the limitation that is only formal jobs. Yeah, but yeah.
But for instance, for crime you could do and everything, right?
Yeah,
but the selection of migration could go both ways, right? For instance, you could go, if you're Catholic, you could move, but also if you are on a neighboring municipality and you are like, agree with what the heck God is saying or whatever, I could just move a bit around, right? To get together, like
yes.
the presence of the church or anything, just combining people from different municipalities.
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. I haven't tested that. I just thought like this would be like a very strong
But anyway,
reaction.
great paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcela. So in the interest of time, I'll just start presenting now. And Marcela, I'll leave you in charge to let me know if I'm running over time. So I have a timer going on here, but you let me know when I have like 1 or 2 minutes, if you can just raise your hand. I appreciate that. So let me share my screen. So you're seeing it? You see my screen? Okay. Let's start the timer. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So I'm glad to present this work. This is joint work with Ricardo, who just presented before, and Laura Schiavone, who's also here in the room. So if you have any questions you wanna put in the chat, they might be able to answer. So to work on selecting top bureaucrats, admission exams, and performance in Brazil. So just to give you a very broad motivation about this work, so we know that public employees play a key role in delivering essential services, right? We have a lot of evidence on that. The issue is that they often, when we look across the world, they face like very low power incentives and lax monitoring on the job. So these characteristics of public service mean that selection becomes really important. It's really relevant who you select to be on the job, if they have intrinsic motivation, if they're excited about it, because maybe on the job, the incentives are not going to be that high powered. But selection also faces constraints. So when you look across the world, a large share of the public servants are actually selected through this or competitive in-person examinations. And this is particularly common among some of the largest developing countries like Brazil, India, and China, where you have both this need to staff this large bureaucracies. As Ricardo will show you, it's actually like growing bureaucracies because there is this centralization going on in several of these countries. And that really opens up the possibility of using your political connections to reward supporters by political leaders. And as a reaction to that, we devised this mechanisms to select public employees that are very impersonal, right? So this is very different from what we observe in the private sector. So in private firms, managers have a lot of discretion in selecting employees. They use a bunch of subjective assessments that play this really important role in selection, and some work has shown that discretion is very relevant. So managers should use that discretion to select the best individuals to do the job. So the question we raise in this paper is, can these mechanisms of public employee selection that are observed across the world that are very objective and impersonal, can they actually screen the best candidates for the job? And we're going to try to answer this question to look at a very specific case, which is, so we provide evidence that in Brazil, these objective examinations are actually predictive about performance in the job for this very specific group of public employees that are very relevant, which are judges at state level. So Sultan knows a lot about judges as well. We've been put together in several panels about judges in developing countries. So I'm happy to have Sultan here once more to hear from him. So what we show in the paper is that similarly to the majority of civil servants in Brazil, and unlike other countries where judges are appointed either by a superior court, by the president, or as in the US, which is an exception, they're voted in Brazil, these judges are actually selected through this very highly competitive and mostly in-person examinations. So they sit these written exams, they have oral exams, and as I'm going to tell you a little bit more, there's also some points that they get for their career achievement. So if you have a master's, if you've been like a public servant before, but this is relatively small compared to the very impersonal part that examinations play. So briefly, what are our findings, if I don't have time to go through all of this? So first, we asked the question, how relevant are judges in explaining what we observe as being the variation in court output? So how do we answer that? We actually explored the fact that judges move across several courts, and we bring the tools from the labor literature that tries to separate observed wages between firm fixed effects and wages and workers fixed effects. And we apply the same methodology to try to separate the output of courts between court fixed effects, so different courts are going to have different demands, and judges fixed effects, right? So what we're estimating here is that judges fixed effects explain at least 1/5 of the total variance they're observing court outputs in our data set. Then the second question that I told you about is exactly, are these admission exams for judges actually predictive about their performance on the job? And how we're going to try to answer the question? Well, we're going to take this estimated judge fixed effects that we firstly estimate in our model, and we're going to show the correlation between these judge fixed effects and their ranking in admission exams. So we scrape data from several of those judges' admission exams, so we can actually see for a cohort of judges how well they did in the entrance exam. And what we document in our paper is that these grades in the entrance exam actually predict performance on the job. So there are several ways to present this correlation. I feel like at this point we converge in something like judges that are in the top quintile of their admission cohorts, they actually perform 0.2 standard deviations higher on the job in terms of how much cases they're solving. So I'm just going to skip the overall contribution, but since Sultan presented today, I feel like I'm really excited to be bringing new evidence about extensive literature that exists on judges in the US, very little from lower income countries, and like there's a lot of really exciting literature coming up in that space. And all this, like also more broader literature on how do we screen individuals in the public sector, which seems to be a key ingredient in trying to understand the quality of delivery of public services. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about the institutional context in Brazil. So we're focused only on state courts in Brazil. So most of the action on the Brazilian judiciary is actually happening at this level. So over 60% of all cases, 70% of judges are at state courts. Each one of the state justices for one of the states is divided in districts, which could be one or more municipalities. As Ricardo was saying, municipalities is kind of like this broad area. Districts here is different from Ricardo's districts. Those are judicial districts. They're broader than municipalities. And then in each one of the districts, you can have one or more courts. So in very small districts, small municipalities, often you're going to have a general courts. If you go to a city like Rio, it's a big city, then they're going to have several specialized courts, right? You have criminal court, civil court, family laws. And you can think of the court as really the production unit of judicial decisions. So a judge sits on a court, cases are assigned to courts, and their decisions are made, right? So all of the state judges that are observed in the data, they are hired through these competitive examinations. They're specific to a state. And these are highly competitive processes, right? Not only because judges' positions are highly prestigious, but as you can see now in the paper, in the newest version, we have some data on wages, and wages for judges are very, very competitive. They're among the highest wages in the country. So it's very competitive. So usually in the data, we observe between 150 and 300 candidates per position that is open for judges at the state level. So how does the admissions exempt work? So for most, so exempt happen at the state level, so there's some degree of variation, but overall they kind of look the same. So all the candidates that sit in exempt, they're ranked according to 4 qualifying and classifying phases. So that means that in each one of the phases, the best performers, they have a grade and they are allowed to go to the next phase. And then at the end, you actually get all the grades from all the previous phases. You have a final ranking and the judges are ranked and the top performers are offered a job, right? So that's what I just said in here. And then like once the judges are selected, they're assigned to small districts usually, which are first level districts. And then throughout their career, they actually move to a larger district, often working in more than one court. And then again, this is a lot of the variation that are going to use is the fact that we observe judges across time working in different courts, but also often at the same time, they offer their service for more than one court, even though they're officially assigned to one court. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the data. So the main data set that we use, it's called the Open Justice System data in Brazil, which is administrative data on a range of quantitative outcomes for all the state judges and courts between 2009 and 2014. We stopped in 2014 because there was a large change in the data, the way that the data was collected, so it's not really comparable after the time. So our main outcome measure is going to be the number of cases that are disposed by judges. So the judges are writing a sentence and finishing a case, but they're also going to look at other outcomes such as hearings, agreements, which all of this, think of this as outputs of what judges are doing, right? So our data set comprises a panel with about 1 million observations at the judge court month level. So we're going to observe each judge assigned to a specific court in a specific month, and then we have all these quantitative outcomes, right? Again, our preferred outcome is going to be the number of cases that a judge in a single court in a month is disposing on the merit. And then the question on the merit here is relevant because cases are often going to be dismissed because of some procedure issue, because one of the parts doesn't want to follow up with a case. So we really try to concentrate on a measure that really relates to judges going through the whole process and making a decision, and not because one of the parties just decided to drop off a case, right? And then in the paper, we show that there's a ton of dispersion when you look across judges on how many cases they're usually disposing on a singular month. And then our second set of data is just, we're going to scrape a bunch of data on this admission exempts to be able to, for each judge in our data set, or a subset of them that we can actually match to this other data, we can observe how they perform in these entrance exams. And then we think of this as selection at the top, because what we're really doing here, and I feel like it's important to explicitly say that, is that we're not comparing how judges that were not selected would perform with judges who were selected. We're looking at this very exclusive set of individuals who were selected to be on the job, but we can actually observe their ranking in the entrance exam. So for judges who were selected, we're going to compare the top performers with the bottom performance. Okay, thank you, Marcelo. Okay, and then we drew a bunch of restrictions in the data. We have all of that in the paper. For interest of time, I'm just going to skip all of this and tell a little bit about our reduced form and empirical strategy. So our first exercise, which is a very reduced form exercise, which is we regress the log of number of cases that were disposed by a judge in a single month, and we assign to each judge on the court their quintile in the entrance exam, right? And then we're going to control for a bunch of stuff, and in different columns, I'm showing you different specifications. So if you focus on the second or third column, which are preferred specifications, what this is telling you is that once we control for cohort fixed effect and court fixed effect and month fixed effect in column 3, judges that are the top quintile of the entrance exam, they decide on average 20 to 22% more cases than judges who are the bottom quintile, right? And then often we can reject the judges who are in the top quintile actually producing the same, the judges who are in the third and fourth quintiles, right? Where we make these comparisons in here. In this last column, we actually do an exercise that is even more stringent, which is not only we control for court and month fixed effect, we control for court by month fixed effect. So all our variation, and that's why our sample is much smaller, is actually coming from judges who are working on the same court on the same month, that enter in the same cohort, and then we're going to compare how much they're producing, right? And then again, the results are actually a bit larger in here, but overall consistent with our findings that judges who perform better in the entrance exam also perform better on the job. So this is very reduced form. So we're clustering our standard errors at the judge level because we're assigning each judge just their quintile, right? So all of the variations coming within judge, but variations coming between judge. We're controlling for the fact that we're observing the same judge often. And this is just the reduced form, right? So the bulk of the paper we try to do is actually try to decompose this effect of individual judges on courts. And we're going to estimate, so these are AKM equations, right, from the labor literature, in which we're regressing the log of number of cases or the inverse hyperbolic sign on a judge fixed effect, court fixed effect, and several controls in here, right? So from the labor literature, we know that to be able to separately identify judge and court fixed effects, or if you're thinking of the labor literature, worker and firm fixed effects, we need to rely on movers, right? So we need to observe the same individual in several different firms or the same judge in several different courts, right? And we can only identify judges and court fixed effects on what we call the connected set, which is the connected group of workers and firms that are connected by individuals who are moving between them. So just to show you very briefly what that looks like in our data. So if we look in a specific month, in this like civil court, we see several workers, several judges working those courts. And then what we can do is we can connect these judges to other courts that they worked over time. So we can start building this like larger connection of judges and courts. If we keep expanding that, we're going to get to a network like that for one of the states. And the key limitation here is that we can only do that for one specific state because we don't observe judges moving between states, right? So each state, it's going to be a separate connected set. So if you look at Rondônia and Amapá, for example, two different states, we never see judges working in both states because judges are selected at the state level. I'm running very low on time. So let me just tell you that we do what is standard in the labor literature to actually try to correct the variance of this fixed effect by the fact that we have a limited sample. So our variance estimates are going to be inflated. In the paper, we're currently doing a lot of work to try to include more discussion on the quantity versus quality trade-offs. We're able to say a lot about the quantity of cases that justices were deciding. We're able, as of now, to say a little bit less on quality, and we're doing more work to be able to say more on that. But let me just show you the results. So here's just the variance decomposition. If you focus on the last column, which shows the percentage of variance that is explained by each one of these components, when we apply this correction for variance estimates, we estimate the judge fixed effect explains at least 23% of the total variance. And as we discussed more in the paper, this is a lower bound because we have several connected sets. So we need to do some normalization. So this at least 23% is explained by judges. And then when we do that, we obtain these judge fixed effects, which are going to allow us to show this correlation between judge fixed effects and their entrance exams, right? So this is just a scatter plot between ranking the exams and the residualized fixed effect. We see this positive correlation between that. And then when we put that in the regression form, again, we're going to do this with quintiles. So I will finish in 30 seconds. So again, we actually find very similar estimates that we find in our reduced form. The judges in the top quintile, they perform about 0.2 standard deviations higher in terms of the fixed effects than judges on the bottom quintile. We can do the same thing. Instead of looking at quintiles, we can just look at their grades standardized. We also see a positive correlation. And then for a very small subset of judges, we can actually see their ranks in all of the exams that they took in all of those phases that I mentioned at the beginning. And we kind of do the same exercise. And our main finding here is that the one exam that seems to be more predictive about performance on the job is the civil case decision, in which judges actually sit down and write a mock-up case, a mock-up decision for a case. So it seems that actually people who perform well on that also perform well on the job. So let me just finish here, just to say, in terms of thoughts for future research, two things that I really want to explore, and I feel like Ricardo and Laura are also excited about, which is first, what it means to be a productive judge. Those management skills, for example, are relevant in here. And two, what exactly these exams are screening for, right? So maybe these exams are not screening for judicial knowledge. They just screen for people who are able to invest a lot of time in preparing for them. And that's something that I think would be really important to clarify. I'm sorry I ran a little bit over time. Marcela, thanks for being generous and not interrupting me. But I think I have some time for discussion now.
I have one question. Your identification relies a lot on people, on judges moving from one city to the other, let's say. But I guess this is not random at all. Just if you have any thoughts on like why people move, how they move, and how this what that means for your identification strategy and results.
Yeah, no, that's a really good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about that I didn't talk about in the presentation. I have a lot of that in the paper, but yeah, like we do rely on judges moving. The movements are not random at all. So promotions, for example, are not random. What I discuss in the paper is that for our estimates to be correct, we don't need movements to be random. We just need to, there are some specific restrictions that are need to make in the data, right? That judges, for example, are not moving because courts are actually becoming better, right? And then we try to do some exercises, some event studies to show, for example, that, once judges move, it's not as if systematically they become more productive. Actually, what happens is that they become a little less productive for a while, which I think is consistent with the fact that, when you move courts, you get new cases, you're finishing out cases. So for a while, the number of cases drop, and then they actually go back to be stable again. But it is important, so we do not rely on the fact that movements are random. We have specific restrictions that I try to test if they are happening or not, and we think that it's not happening in our data. But it's an important question. Thank you.
Just going on the same direction, very quick. This is the answer already, but just because I don't understand the general framework. How frequent, for instance, picking the labor case, so you have movements among firms between workers, and this has some frequency, let's say, but judges in Brazil, they could move a lot. Could they move, I don't know, but could they move like every month or like some days of specific weeks? This is one question. And the other one along the same lines is, for instance, if you have a court that somehow has some overload of cases, and then they ask for help, and then you send someone there, or some judge in that court has like a health shock, for instance, and they will be like 4 months out and they need some help. So this could make the court itself more inefficient, or the inefficiency itself could be bringing new players in the game.
It's a great question. Yeah, no. So one, I feel like the advantage that we have compared to the labor literature in terms of like amount of movies, actually, we see much more moving. So the issue of like limited mobility bias, it's much less of an issue here because we see a lot of moving, but then the issue is like what's going on with this moving, right? So one thing that we do is, and I didn't have time to talk about that, but like we restrict to when we observe a judge court pair for at least 3 months together on a spell. So often we're going to see a judge in a given court in a month, and then they never show up again. So we're not using that variation at all, but we do control for the fact in our estimating equation that for every month, what is the number of courts that judges were working in, and what are the number of judges working in a single court. So we control for the fact that judges might be on a month helping a colleague somewhere else, and they're working one more court, so they might be less productive, but we're not using that variation to estimate the judge fixed effect. Exactly because we try to just like throw out this like garbage variation of, like my colleague got sick, so I worked on that court for a month, and maybe I was much less productive. So basically try to look at more stable spells. And then in the paper, have a bunch of, maybe in the latest version of the paper, we have a bunch of robustness exercises that try to show that we can, like restrict the sample in different ways, and we still see like very similar results. Yeah, but thank you very much for the questions. So we have about 5 minutes more. So I just want to open the floor now in case there are questions for the other presenters. I don't want to use the fact that I was the last to present to get more questions. So I'm just open the floor. Is there any other questions to the other presenters?
By the way, great work. It was really interesting, very clever identification.
Anything that the presenters want to ask? So maybe one question that I have for Marcela. It's a really cool paper. I feel like this is like a very, very relevant topic that I still have like a little empirical evidence on. Do you have data on either viewership of these channels? I I saw that you showed like that quick graph that has some kind of viewership. I don't know if it was exactly for Record. And do you have any data on radio? Because I know that at the same time in the 90s, it was a time like during democratization where basically all the radio channels were distributed, right? And I know that a lot of it went to evangelical politicians, right? With something that lasts until today. Like a lot of politicians are radio owners. So do you have any data on either of those things and try to see like how that interacts with Record?
Right. About the viewership, I do have data, but only for a few cities like metropolitan regions. And so it's not like a lot. It's like from 10 cities, 10 big cities. And I know exactly what is the viewership. And I use that to validate the signal strength, the measure of the signal strength, just to argue that you need there's a cutoff where you start having viewership, and also to compute the implicit persuasion rate, which is like we use the parameters that we estimated and the viewership to shed some light on how many people Record actually could persuade to convert. And we find like that is like a range that is very consistent with the literature. That is about 80% of the viewers were convinced to convert to Pentecostalism. But unfortunately, like this is not the best data, it's just for 10 cities. And about the other data about radio stations, we do have it, like this data exists. We did not compute the signal strength. We can go further and also analyze the effect of the radio, but we haven't done that yet. And I don't think we're planning to do, just because for radio is much more complicated, because to figure out exactly who is affiliated, whether it's evangelical or not, is not so straightforward to see that. We could just pick up some examples and compute all of them. But yeah, but so far we are restricting to TV, that we believe there's like a very compelling chance of like being very persuasive. Yeah. But yeah, but do you have any thoughts, like if any radio station could be interesting?
So at some point in the PhD, I read a little bit about it, one of those projects that I dropped, which was like in the Sarney government, there was like a huge reform of radio and they just distributed all the ownership, right? And I remember reading like some sociology work about who were the evangelical politicians who got that.
Yeah. There's even
I read this too. It was an interesting case.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
By who? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that
no, I was just saying
there's
that,
even a paper by Dani Hidalgo. I'm sorry. There's a bit of lag.
Yeah, during this like a year over the Sarney government, he wanted to get some support to approve like the new constitution, something like that, and then he let people just get approve a lot of radio licenses. But to me, it's just hard to figure out like who is the owner, in fact, because you won't have the name of the radio station. So it's a bit hard to figure out like who is evangelical, who is not, and so.
Yeah, Dani Hidalgo has a paper called Controlling the Airwaves with Brazilian data and data on ownership of radio stations, which I think contains names of owners, but I agree that mapping whether they are evangelical or Catholic or whatnot, it's harder.
Yeah.
Okay, Anya, I feel like we have like 1 minute left. So let me just wrap this up. Thanks very much, Marcela, Ricardo, Felix Sultan have to leave us. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for presenting. It was like a great session. Thanks everyone. Of course, you're watching. Thanks for the questions. I feel like it was like very helpful. And yeah, hope to see you all around. And we're working on the same thing, so let's be in touch. Thank you very much, everyone. And Juan, thank you very much for the support.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.